This pub is closed. I'm locking the doors, and that goes for the rest of you, so hurry up.
Rudeness ain't called for, Dennis.
This is the story of what happened to Leslie Grantham after Dirty Den Watts left the square for good. The scandal that ended his second run on EastEnders, the years in Bulgaria, and the quiet, complicated ending to a life that never escaped its past. Before getting into those final years, it helps to remember just how unlikely Grantham's path to fame had been in the first place, because it shapes everything that came after.
Before we start playing kiss chase with each other, I think we should talk.
Well, you think you can just stitch me up and walk away from me?
Oh, no.
Roughly 10 years in prison for murder came first, the result of shooting and killing a taxi driver named Felix Rees in Germany back in 1966 during a robbery that went badly wrong. Acting found him almost by accident after that through prison plays performed at the open prison HMP Leyhill, where a fellow inmate, the disgraced former Newcastle politician T. Dan Smith, pushed him toward the profession, and so did the actress Louise Jameson, known for playing Leela in Doctor Who met him during her volunteer visits to the prison. Training followed at the Webber Douglas Academy of Dramatic Art, funded by his own work as a painter and decorator. Casting as Den Watts came in 1985, and just 3 days after EastEnders launched, his murder conviction became public in what turned into the show's very first media scandal. He'd already told producers about the conviction beforehand, though, and they kept him in the role anyway. That willingness to carry on despite public scrutiny would end up defining the rest of his career, including the years this video is really about. By 2004, Grantham was back where he'd started, 14 years after his character had seemingly been killed off in a shooting outside the Queen Vic. He'd returned to EastEnders in September 2003, delivering the line that would define his comeback. "Hello, Princess," spoken to the daughter he'd never known had survived. Nearly 17 million people watched that episode, and for a man who'd spent over a decade away from the show that made him famous, this looked like the start of a genuine second act. It lasted less than a year. May 2004 is when a national newspaper published the details of a webcam sex session Grantham had engaged in with an undercover reporter, recorded in his own BBC dressing room while he was dressed as Captain Hook for a pantomime role. During that session, he'd insulted several of his EastEnders co-stars by name, including Shane Ritchie, Wendy Richard, Kim Metcalf, and Jesse Wallace. And once the story broke publicly, the fallout came fast. A 2-month suspension followed, along with a pay cut. Grantham apologized to his bosses and pledged a donation to charity, but the damage to his standing with colleagues, the very people he'd insulted on tape, proved harder to undo than any apology could manage. By November, producers announced his contract wouldn't be renewed. Den Watts was killed off for good on the 18th of February 2005 in the show's 20th anniversary episode, bludgeoned with a doorstop by his on-screen wife, Chrissy, played by Tracy Ann Oberman. 14 million people tuned in that night, a peak audience share of nearly 58%, and this time there'd be no coming back. Grantham later spoke candidly about what that period did to him.
Would you like a drink?
No, I would not like a drink.
Don't do anything stupid! Hands, please!
Admitting he'd attempted to take his own life 3 times in the scandal's aftermath. In his own words, "I was probably in such a mindset I wouldn't have noticed even if I'd been run down by a lorry. Of course I have regrets, but you can't go round wearing a hair shirt all your life. Otherwise, you'll never get out of bed in the morning. I fucked up. Now, I'm going to move on." Blunt, unapologetic, but startlingly honest about the toll. That statement became something of a template for how Grantham talked about his own life from that point on. Sympathy wasn't something he asked for, and dressing things up wasn't something he bothered with either. That same unsentimental tone would go on to define almost everything he said publicly about his past. Public life didn't lose Grantham after the scandal, whatever the tabloids might have expected. That same year, 2005, he directed and starred in a Peter Pan pantomime in St. Albans and toured in a stage production called Beyond Reasonable Doubt. Whatever had happened at the BBC, every account on record shows a man still working, still turning up, still building a life around performance. October 2006 brought his autobiography, Life and Other Times, published through Timewell Press, and he was reportedly paid a substantial sum for it. The book gave him a chance to tell his own version of events, the murder conviction, the prison years, the EastEnders scandal, in his own words, rather than through tabloid headlines. Television called again, around the same time too, with a role in the bill as a character named Jimmy Collins in an episode that aired in February 2007. Stage work kept coming after that. A production called The Decorator took him on tour in 2007, and he played Private Walker in a stage version of Dad's Army, a small but telling detail, given that Dad's Army represents exactly the kind of beloved, gentle British comedy his own public image had never quite been allowed to be.
Now, come along, please. Time. On your way. On our way? Sharon, upstairs.
Bulgaria called him to film The English Neighbour in 2010, and later that same year, he took on Scrooge in a run of A Christmas Carol, performed between late November and mid-December. None of this added up to a single dramatic comeback. What it amounted to instead was a man rebuilding a working life project by project, largely outside the spotlight that had once made him one of the most recognizable faces on British television. Through panto, touring theatre, the occasional television role, the unglamorous mechanics of an actor's career grinding on after the headlines had moved elsewhere. One strange detail from earlier in his career took on a different resonance, given everything else about his life. Years before these final decades, Grantham had played Colonel Mustard in the 1990 film version of the board game Cluedo, a fictional murder suspect played in real life by a convicted murderer. Shock value would be the easy read on that, but by every account from those who worked with him, Grantham approached it, like most things, with dry humor rather than discomfort. That same wit followed him everywhere. In interviews, he'd point out being asked the same two questions over and over, the murder conviction, which he tended to wave off as being in the past, between him and his God, and what he'd done since leaving EastEnders, a subject he engaged with far more openly. And here's the thing about how audiences actually felt. Despite everything that had happened by the mid-2000s, his work as Den Watts still resonated, landing him at number 12 in one retrospective poll of the 100 greatest EastEnders characters, cited by IMDb, proof that the affection people held for the character had outlasted the scandal that ended his run. 2013 brought its own reckoning, separate entirely from his career. After roughly 31 years of marriage, Grantham and his wife, the actress Jane Laurie, divorced and homelessness followed, with him staying in a friend's spare room rather than a home of his own. The man who'd once commanded audiences of over 30 million on Christmas Day found himself, by his own account and by press reporting at the time, starting over with next to nothing. Somewhere between 2013 and 2016, in the years following his divorce, Bulgaria became home. A flat there and a relationship with a Bulgarian woman marked a complete departure from the life he'd lived in Britain, a country where his face and his history were both instantly recognizable, for better and for worse. That move wasn't entirely disconnected from his earlier work either. Filming The English Neighbor in Bulgaria back in 2010 had come years before he made the country his home, and by his own joking account, he'd had to pick up the language for the role at short notice, telling people at the time, "They said they were going to dub the show for me, but on the first day of filming, I had to speak Bulgarian." It's a small anecdote, but it captures something real about how Grantham talked about even difficult moments with a kind of dry, self-deprecating humor rather than complaint. And that's where a new creative outlet emerged, one that had nothing to do with acting at all, in what felt like a quieter, more private chapter of his life. July 2016 saw the publication of a children's fantasy novel called Jack Bates and the Wizard's Spell through a publisher called Cambridge Academic, running 360 pages and aimed, in Grantham's own words, at kids from 8 to 80. Weaving through it was the real historical mystery of the princes in the tower and Richard III, folded into a fantasy narrative full of fairies, pixies, dwarves, and trolls, and he reportedly hoped it would become the first installment in a trilogy, though nothing in the record shows whether further books ever followed. That same year, he became a director of Cambridge Academic Limited, the small publishing firm behind the book. Modest hardly covers it by any commercial measure. One tabloid report put the company's net worth at just over £22,000, but it meant something all the same. A man in his late 60s, decades removed from his most famous role and his most public disgrace, was still building something new, still putting his name to a project instead of simply living off his past. Here's where the tidy tabloid version falls apart. The simple idea that he'd fallen from fame straight into ruin doesn't hold up against what the record actually shows, which is messier and more human than that framing allows. Broke and homeless is how the press described him at various points in these years, and in the very same years, published novelist and company director described him too. Both things appear to have been true at once, which might be the most honest way to understand what this stage of his life actually looked like. Failing health didn't stop Grantham from taking on what would become his final acting role in early 2018, playing the Metropolitan Police detective known as Nipper, read in a film called The Craze, Dead Man Walking. According to the film's producer, Jonathan Sock, finishing that role mattered to Grantham because the film's director, Richard Taylor, was reportedly his close friend, and Sock has said the frail actor had to be driven around the set because he could barely walk under his own power by that point in his illness. Loyalty and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. That's what this looks like from every angle in the research. A man in visibly poor health choosing to honor a friendship and finish a job rather than walk away. It turned out to be the last time audiences saw him on screen. June 2018 brought him back to the United Kingdom from Bulgaria, seeking medical treatment, and he was reported at the time to be gravely ill. He died at 10:20 in the morning on the 15th of June 2018 at the age of 71. His friend Joe Tracini, the actor who was with him near the end, later described their final exchange in terms that struck many people as characteristically Grantham. Tracini's words were, "I held his hand for a while, kissed his forehead, and told him I loved him. As I left, he bellowed, 'What? Am I fucking dying or something?' A very fitting way for him to go, according to someone who knew him well. Blunt, darkly funny, resistant to sentimentality, right up until the very end." His family released a formal statement afterward. "We formally announce the loss of Leslie Grantham, who passed away at 10:20 a.m. on the morning of Friday, June 15th, 2018. His ex-wife and sons have asked for their privacy to be respected at this difficult time, and for there to be no approaches to them for information or comment. Television, the The world that had made him famous is where nearly every tribute after his death came from. Anita Dobson, who'd played his on-screen wife Angie Watts, put it this way: "I loved working with Leslie, and I will never forget our time together on EastEnders. Fun to be around, and the archetypal charming rogue," is how she described him further, and about the quality that made him so watchable on screen. Her words were, "There was always that look about him that you didn't know what he was going to do next. That was his ace in the hole." She'd reportedly intended to visit him in hospital to tell him he'd made television history. June Brown, who played the long-running character Dot Cotton, offered her own tribute. "I was very fond of Leslie, and am so sorry that he has gone. I always enjoyed talking to him. He made me laugh and always had a twinkle in his eye when he said outrageous things. A wonderful and special actor," is how she summed him up. Witty and very talented, a tribute that spoke as much to his character as to his craft. An official statement came too from John York, an EastEnders executive consultant, speaking on behalf of the show itself. "Everyone at EastEnders is deeply saddened to hear that Leslie has passed away. We extend our deepest sympathies and condolences to his family and friends at this extremely difficult time." But straightforward mourning wasn't the only public reaction. X Factor winner Steve Brookstein posted a message on social media that went viral in the days that followed, reading in full, "Leslie Grantham has died. As a young man, he shot dead a taxi driver in an attempted robbery. Grantham served life, 10 years. He came out and created a new life as an actor, became famous and then died. My thoughts are with the family of the taxi driver." Warm tributes from people who'd worked alongside him for years on one side, pointed public reminders of the crime he'd committed as a young man on the other. That tension followed Grantham throughout his career and followed him straight into death as well. He'd spoken about the killing himself more than once in terms that made no attempt to soften or excuse it. "When you've done something as bad as I've done, you don't forget about it. It's a shame that I have to carry forever. It haunts me to this day. I despise myself for what I did, but I don't think apologizing serves any purpose. I cannot alter history." Forgiveness from the victim's widow or daughter was never something he sought, and he said publicly that an apology wouldn't serve any real purpose in his eyes. A rare kind of honesty is how some heard that. Coldness is how others heard it. Both readings seem genuinely available to anyone looking at his life. One more matter connected to his final years is more serious and remains unresolved, and it deserves real care here. After his death, an investigative journalist named Mark Williams Thomas, known for his earlier work exposing Jimmy Savile, stated publicly that he'd investigated an allegation against Grantham back in 2012 in the wake of the Savile revelations. A woman had claimed Grantham abused her when she was between 14 and 15 years old, sometime around 2009 to 2010. And that allegation, according to Williams Thomas's own public statements, got referred to the Metropolitan Police's Operation U-Tree. The case never proceeded, though, because the alleged victim didn't want it to go forward, and no charges were ever filed against Grantham in connection with it. No prosecution followed, and no conviction either. Strictly by what the research shows, this remains a contested and unresolved allegation rather than an established fact, included here only because it's part of the public record surrounding how his life and legacy have continued to be discussed since he died. Decline doesn't sum up Grantham's final years after EastEnders, and neither does redemption, not in any tidy sense. What comes closer is something messier, the way most real lives actually look under close examination, contradictory, incomplete, marked by genuine setbacks and quiet perseverance running side by side. A marriage of over 3 decades was gone, and reportedly a home along with it. A public scandal ended his second run on the very show that had made him a household name, and by his own account, it drove him to attempt suicide 3 times in the aftermath. And yet the work kept coming in the years after, on stage, on screen, and eventually as a published novelist and a small company director in a country far from the one that knew him best. Geographically and otherwise, he died far removed from the version of himself that over 30 million people once watched on a single Christmas Day broadcast. But by his close friend's own account, he died still fundamentally himself, sharp-tongued, unsentimental, resistant to being defined by any single chapter of a life that had contained a great many of them. Nearly 2 decades on from when his character was killed off for good, Den Watts still lives on in EastEnders history, referenced in later storylines, remembered in anniversary specials, still one of the most vivid and unforgettable characters the show ever produced for millions of British viewers who grew up watching him. Leslie Grantham, the man behind him, left behind a life that was always going to be far harder to sum up in a single line.